Hello, I'm Noel Kingsbury, and with Annie Guilfoyle, I run Garden Masterclass. Now, this event is a recording of one of our Thursday garden chats, which happen at 6 o'clock London time every Thursday evening. This is a pro bono event, which we started doing in April 2020 during the first lockdown. Our aim is to talk to interesting and entertaining garden people. They could be gardeners, they could be amateur growers, they could be designers or botanists. And we talk to people from all over, from the Americas, from the Southern Hemisphere, from Asia. We like to think that we bring you the cutting edge of horticulture and our engagement with plants. So all of these recordings go on to our YouTube channel and eventually move on to our website. And the best ones are for members only. Our membership entitles you to access to premium material, to a forum, to keep in touch with other members and perhaps seek or offer information, and various discounts and special invitation-only events. Or, if you like, you can just keep in touch by signing up for our monthly email newsletter. So all of this is explained on our website, gardenmasterclass.org. So here's hoping you will enjoy this recording, and hoping perhaps you'll come and join us, or at least keep in touch.
No, yes. So this evening we are venturing down to St.Ives, which is one of my favourite parts of the world, of the country. Rather blowy and blustery down there on the coast, and into Cornwall. And we've got Sid Hill, who is our guest, and it's really lovely to have Sid along. I'm trying to think when I very first became aware of Sid, and I think you were on Gardener's World, Sid, quite a long time ago, weren't you? Several years ago. Is that right?
Yeah.
I'm sure. How many years ago?
3 years ago first, and then 2 years ago it was repeated.
Right, yeah, okay, that's what I thought. We do have a little tiny bit of a delay with Sid, and I think that's probably because Cornwall's a long way away. Maybe because it's a bit blustery and windy. So just bear that in mind anyway. But it's lovely to have you, Sid. And then, of course, recently I saw Sid at the Beth Chatto conference, and some of you may have gone along in person, and some of you may have watched it live or watched the recording. And Sid was very much part of a sort of the next generation coming through of horticulturalists and designers and ecologists, and it was a really exciting event. And I think everybody left very optimistic and hopeful that not only there was a nice wave of younger people coming through with exciting ideas and interesting ideas and ways that they're going to be working. So that was wonderful. So Sid, welcome. It's lovely to have you here.
Thanks, Annie.
That's okay. That's okay. A little bit of a delay. But Sid, would you like to go straight into screen share and then start, because I know that has a bit of an introduction to you and your childhood and so on.
Yeah, I'll go straight into it.
And as usual, everybody, if you've got questions for Sid, if you tap them into the chat box, we can ask questions at the end of Sid's talk. Okay, looking good, Sid. Yep, looking good.
I'm Sid, and thanks for coming and joining this evening and coming to view and see my work. I'm based in, as Annie just said, based in St.Ives in Cornwall, and I've been running a landscape design and build and gardening business for the last 14 years, really specialising in ecological gardens. And my real passion is how can we tend the land to support our needs while supporting the needs and enhancing biodiversity, and really just trying to create landscapes that are truly multifunctional and provide as many benefits as we can. So this talk is really going to focus on my work looking at edible ecosystems, because really my passion is ethnobotany, so the study of useful plants for food, medicine, fibre, and then really looking at how we can take from the current research and understanding of ecological design to then create really biodiverse, beautiful, edible ecosystems. So I've actually been doing this since I was a child. I had a bit of a alternative upbringing, and I was brought up, well, I spent 6 years of my childhood in Portugal, near where Noel lives now. And whilst I was out there, we grew edible forest garden, a time preserving our harvests, making olive oil, and really growing up having this opportunity to go out into the garden and harvest fresh fruit and vegetables is such a big influencer for me, especially when I came back to England and I realized that not many children today in England get this opportunity. And it's this connection with the environment and plants around us that make us care about its health and well-being. So if you remove this connection, how can we expect our culture to actually care for the wildlife and the ecosystems around us? So I think this upbringing on the land, learning about edible forest gardening, permaculture, and like self-sufficiency, this had a real big influence on my current practice. But it was when I was about 15 when I came back to England, and I got a bit down about the current state of the world, climate change, pollution, and all of these big issues that are very difficult to resolve as an individual. But then I'd already been taught about permaculture, but I got more interested in it. And I came across the work of Jeff Lawton, where he was regreening the Jordan Desert, but he was regreening it with edible forest gardens, creating these edible ecosystems that supported people improving their lives whilst regreening a desert. And as soon as you regreen a desert, that brings the water back into the landscape, which then can support the regeneration of more plants. So this is just a little picture with before and after of this regreening with edible landscapes. So when I was really inspired by permaculture, then I went to university to study ethnobotany, because a lot of the techniques used in permaculture are inspired by what humans have been doing for thousands of years, because it's only been recent history that we've started degrading the environments around us completely. And actually, well, in history, there are cultures that have also degraded environment, but there's also horticultural cultures that have lived within the landscape for thousands of years and enhanced the ecological diversity and health. So this is an image of a Salish edible forest garden along the Pacific coast of Canada. And this is a really beautiful example of an edible forest garden that was created, and then the people were displaced through European settlers. But the landscape was left without management for 150 years. And what they found that this land is still, it has increased biodiversity. So if you look at it where it's outlined, the surrounding woodland is conifer woodland. And then people have tended this landscape for hundreds of years, transplanting and moving plants. And this is the thing with gardening is traditional ecological knowledge that we've been practicing these different methods throughout our history. And so with this example, is the reason it's managed to be able to stand the test of time is because of this layering system of planting, where they've got a ground cover, they've got short herbaceous plants, taller herbaceous plants, they've got shrubs, trees, climbers, canopy trees. And when you're creating these layered plantings, you're filling up all of the ecological niches with the plants that you can use for food, medicine, fiber. But when you fill up all of these niches, that means it's more resistant to weed species getting established. So that's why this garden has been able to maintain itself with similar species for 150 years without ongoing management from people. So I just wanted to share this because it just shows how we've been practicing ecological gardening for thousands of years. And today it's becoming quite a buzzword, this idea of ecological planting designs. But we've been doing this as a culture throughout our history. So, and then whilst I was at university, I really got onto this idea of designed plant communities from people like Nigel Dunnett and the Sheffield School. And so this is that idea of designing a plant community in layers. So this is a little illustration taken from Planting in a Post-Wild World. And then what I've done here is I've just given some examples on the side of Nigel Dunnett's plantings and how these are actually different places, but it shows quite nicely how you can have a layered planting. You can have the ground cover layer and then or low layer, middle layer, and then a high layer. And this can be replicated in woodland plantings or meadow plantings. So it's just a really nice principle to take and then to apply this to your planting designs. So and then when I was at university, I became really inspired by the designed meadows. But coming from a permaculture background, I thought, so can we not design these with the thousands of edible plants available to us today to create these really biodiverse, beautiful, low maintenance plantings, but incorporate edible plants from around the world found in plant communities? So now over the last 5 years, I've been researching and experimenting with this idea of designing edible wildflower meadows. And if you look to a lot of these different designers who are creating designed wildflower meadows, often a lot of their research goes hand in hand with ethnobotany. So here's a picture of one of Nigel Dunnett's inspirations, which this is something he found in China. But in this picture, we've got Persicaria bistorta. And Persicaria bistorta has a long history of use in the UK as a perennial vegetable. And here you can see it has this beautiful effect. But so as a perennial vegetable in the north of England, in Yorkshire, they've actually got the World Dock Pudding Championship, where the reason they call it dock because it looks quite similar to the dock leaf. So this little dock pudding, what they would make is a bit like a black pudding, but then they would use wild harvested leaves, animal fat, and they would eat it with the English fried breakfast. So then going over to British Columbia, and I think a few people here, and this is from the Pacific coast. And so this is a Gary Oaks ecosystem. And this is a ecosystem that has evolved with people for thousands of years, and it is an anthropogenic landscape. But the Salish people have tended this ecosystem for the Camassia bulbs, which for me, this is really inspiring because it shows how we can live in symbiosis with the landscape around us. And actually, the Salish people, this used to be one of their staple crops with salmon. And this practice was really just obliterated by European settlers who came over, and they didn't recognize that this was a form of food production, a sensitive tending of the land, really intelligent tending to be able to support their needs whilst enhancing biodiversity. another one of the Camassia meadows. So there's a whole host of other plants as well that they're tennis meadows for. But I'm really interested in the effect of the Camassia and how actually that can evoke this same feeling what we get from a lot of these really beautiful designed meadows, but using a Camassia, which can provide a really great starchy crop. So then going into meadows. So over the last 5 years, yeah, I've been experimenting with this idea, taking lots of inspiration from all of my research, and then designing seed mixes, so this is an edible meadow designed with 30 different edible plants in it, arranged layered system. So this is the first year, so you can see a lot of annuals in that. And in the first year from this meadow, I managed to harvest a salad of 19 different species. But there's so much opportunity because in meadows around the world, there are plants which are edible and can be used for roots, shoots, leaves, flowers, seeds. But it really just takes experimentation to be able to figure out what the best ways to use these. And it's really this idea of an edimental meadow, edible ornamental meadows, with really what inspired me to do this initially as well is this idea of how art can really capture people's attention, which once you have people's attention, that then gives you the opportunity to teach them about ecology, sustainability, or eco-literacy. So, but that's the key thing, and the amazing thing about being able to create beautiful landscapes is even for people who aren't interested in plants, they look at it and they go, oh, wow, that's really beautiful. Then that gives you the opportunity to inspire them and to teach them about the landscapes around them. So one of the niches what I filled with the edible meadows is a vegetable, an annual vegetable layer. So really what I've realized is when we create meadows, quite often in the first year, there are gaps where the perennials need space to be able to fill it in. Because if a meadow is too crowded, that actually reduces its success, what I've found of a lot of the perennials, because it makes them struggle in the first year. Whereas if you're creating a horticultural design meadow in your garden, if you put in an annual layer of vegetables, things like turnip, radish, beetroot, that really fills that niche of the annuals where they quickly get established, and then you harvest them, making space for the perennials as the season progresses. And really, this is also tapping into the succession of plant communities, because in succession you have bare ground, annuals become established, short-lived perennials and biennials, longer-lived perennials, shrubs, trees. So in my thinking, if we're going to create a long-term meadow, perennial meadow, what better way to do it than actually plant in annuals in the first year, so that they're bringing in the microbiology and preparing the ground for the later stage succession. So here's one of my edible meadows. As you can see, the white flower, that is bladder campion, which is a good leaf crop. And there's just so much going on in there. There's so many different plants you can harvest and make salads or vegetables. But from the untrained eye, you wouldn't know that. So over the last 5 years, I've been doing quite a lot of exploring different landscapes to understand how these different edible plants grow in the wild. So a lot of my research, I've been looking in Italy, and some of the plants I've come across is Italian bugless, which is a really great perennial vegetable. It's in the borage family, but it does still have quite hairy leaves like borage, but they're removed when you cook them. And here the other picture is bladder campion, which, yeah, the leaves can be eaten in salads, and it's a bit like pea shoots if you've ever tried them. And what I've found is it's been so valuable traveling and going and looking in different landscapes and looking at plants to see how they behave, because but the plants behave so differently depending on the environmental conditions, the fertility of the soil. And when you're thinking about eating plants, you want to be taking that into consideration as well. And in my research across Italy, I've found just some incredible discoveries. So this is pistic, a dish using 56 wild harvested plants. And I just think that's an incredible example of how we can harvest plants to make a truly diverse and nutritional food. So, and I've found other dishes as well, like in Tuscany, there's a soup with 50 plus different wild harvested plants in it. And because Italians are renowned for really good cooking. So I'm sure even with a dish with 56 different wild harvested plants in it, I'm sure that still tastes really good. So this is a dish traditionally made in Western Friuli, which is in the northeast of Italy. So with my exploring around Italy, I've come across Vicia faba plants being grown in these annual meadows, which is it was actually doing really quite well, and they were all producing quite a lot of these broad beans. And I just found this was really interesting on a garden scale, so that we can actually grow broad beans in these diverse plant communities, and how they can cope with the competition of other plants. And this got me researching, because these looked really healthy, but got me researching in deeper about Vicia faba. And quite often when people grow broad beans at home, they'll grow them in vegetable beds where they dig every year. And if anyone's grown broad beans, they'll know that they suffer with aphids, like a black aphid. And something I've managed to find was the fact that Vicia faba, one plant, what we found, shares infochemicals in the soil between plants through the mycorrhizal fungi. And what this means is if one plant gets the aphid, it can then share information to the other plants using these networks of mycelium to tell the other plants through these infochemicals to start creating alkaloids to be able to protect them from the aphids. But if we break up the soil through cultivation, that means we break up these mycorrhizal networks and we reduce the plant's ability for like natural self-defense. So I just think it's really interesting, this idea of how we can grow more wild or ecological plantings with wild type plants so that they're not so dependent on us, but then can still grow our food. So here is a design that I created. This is a designed meadow with, particularly I want you to pay attention to the musk mallow in this design, which I recommend mallow in salads because it's a really good salad crop and it doesn't have a strong flavor. So I use it quite a lot. And the thing is a lot of wild plants or wild salad crops might have quite a strong flavor, that's why it's really good when you can come across a plant without a strong flavor so you can use it in bulk. Some people have noted about the potential laxative effect of musk mallow, but I've found any issues with it. This is Turkish rocket, which is in the mustard family, and you can see on the right it thriving in this meadow plant community. But it's a really great perennial vegetable that just is so edible, and you can eat the flower buds a bit like you would sprouting broccoli. and I think it's got a lot of potential as a really low maintenance and successful perennial vegetable that produces these beautiful flowers that are also really good for wildlife. And with my sort of inspiration from permaculture, someone I've been aware about and studied his work a lot is Sid Hill, and he was an Austrian permaculturalist or agroecologist, and I'm really inspired by his work because he's known for creating seed mixes and then scattering them across the landscape. And what he would do is he would create disturbance using animals from his farming and then have these seed mixes. And I came across, sorry about the quality, but this is one of his pictures in his book. And this is a lupin. And this is just such a beautiful image of how he's actually creating a farming system, and then he's scattering plants that can actually be used in any ornamental landscape or ecological planting. And if this was a better quality picture, this could be mistaken for any really inspiring botanical garden or ecological planting. But then he's got planted in that a variety of different fruit trees, and then he's also grazing it with different livestock. Another image of his. And so what he would be doing with these seed mixes is he uses it to activate the microbiology. So in this picture, again, it's lupin, which is a nitrogen fixing plant. It's got a relationship with I can't remember what it's called right now. Yeah, so it's got a connection with a bacteria in the soil that fixes nitrogen, which then in this farming system that makes that nitrogen available for other fruiting plants or trees or crops. And the key thing about lupin is it's also got a deep root system that helps mine nutrients and bring them up, making them more available for the other plants in the ecosystem. Because actually a lot of fruit trees are known for having shallow root systems. So if we can plant these other companion plants that bring up nutrients for those trees, we can support their growth and enhance their fruiting. And one of the really brilliant things about this image and the idea of using lupin in these designed seed mixes is actually in Portugal, growing up out there. You don't really get it in England, but in Southern Europe, people eat lupin beans quite regularly. And they're just this really nice pickled bean, which, yeah, it's just a really nice savory snack. So this idea of rewilding is becoming really popular, and I've seen there's a lot of misunderstanding in it as a practice, because quite often people think rewilding is just to leave a landscape go wild, but it's not. Rewilding is to reintroduce ecosystem processes, and by doing that, we really need to be reintroducing animals or be doing the same actions or specific characteristics animals play in an ecosystem. So you can't, especially in some parts of the world, yes, you probably can just leave an area to rewild. But here in England, we're in Ireland and we've wiped out most of our animal species. So if you leave just an area to rewild, it's not actually going to reintroduce those ecosystem processes for a very long time. Whereas what I'm really interested in is how we can reintroduce ecosystem processes with farming methods using animals, or if we don't use animals, how can we replicate these specific characteristics of animals to reintroduce these ecosystem processes into our landscape? So one of the methods I regularly use is what I call chicken scratch, where you scratch up the surface of the soil really replicating the behavior of chickens, because if anyone's left chickens on an area for a period of time, they'll know that they scratch up the ground. And what that does is that creates a disturbance which is necessary for other plants to get established. So regularly when I'm creating new meadows or trying to get more diversity into a meadow, I would use this chicken scratch method where I scratch the surface of the soil, and then that creates the opportunity for new seedlings to get established. So I'll scatter a new thing over that. Or there's an example down here in the right hand corner. I came across these mining bees, and in the area there was where a fox had dug a hole, and on the edge of where the fox had dug the hole, there was a lot more bee holes in that, because it created the conditions necessary for them to get established. Whereas if you don't have that disturbance from animals, there isn't as much diversity in the landscape, structural diversity necessary to support insect populations and a whole healthy ecosystem. And that's what I'm really interested in, is the question of, is agroecology a form of rewilding, where we're using animals to their specific characteristics across the landscape to enhance ecological health, but then also producing our food and the resources we need. And I think that this is really the key going forwards if we're going to live on this planet in symbiosis with other life. And it's not a new thing. We've been doing this for thousands of years in different horticultural cultures, tending the landscape, enhancing ecological diversity, and providing really nutritional and healthy foods for us. So then we're coming on to edible forest gardens. And this is an idea which has been becoming more and more popular over recent years. And it's something what I would like to point out is edible forest gardens has become very popular, and we've found a lot of examples throughout the world in indigenous cultures where they've tended these edible woodlands with these multi-layered plantings for their food source. But edible forest gardens are a later stage successionary planting. So from bare ground all the way through the different stages of succession up to woodland. And when you get to a later stage successional planting, it's much more stable in that, from the example I showed at the Salish Sea, an edible forest garden had been left for 150 years without management, and it had stayed similar structure. Whereas if we look to edible wildflower meadows, that's a much more dynamic system, in that if you leave that in just a few years, the structure and the plant community can change significantly. So this means that over our history, we might have lost many different examples of how people tended wildflower meadow plant communities for their food source, edible, biodiverse and beautiful meadows. And what I'm really interested in is how we can take and learn from our past of how we've tended these ecosystems, and then apply our current understanding of ecological design theory so that we can design these really beautiful biodiverse plantings, but then be planting them in our urban environments or our gardens. So back to edible forest gardening, where it's a layered system. So you might have canopy trees, which would be emergent species, plants like alder, which is a nitrogen fixing tree. And what you might want to do is remove the lower branches to open up to allow light to the lower layers. Then you might have an understory tree, understory layer, where it might be short fruit trees, and then a shrub layer, a climbing layer, herbaceous layer, ground cover layer. And really you're just trying to fit as many different layers into a small area so that you can be creating a really diverse multi-layered planting, but then be incorporating edible plants into each layer. So in the edible forest gardens and the edible landscapes I've been creating is from an early age being inspired by permaculture, edible forest gardening. And really, when I was studying, I was looking online and I was trying to find examples of edible forest gardens to use in my work. And many of the edible forest gardens weren't very beautiful, or they were beautiful to me because I understood the details involved in it and the benefits that was providing in the edible plants. But to someone who wasn't an enthusiast and passionate about edible forest gardening, this would have just looked like a messy garden. So what I've been trying to do in my work is I've been trying to take the inspiration from edible forest and garden design to come up with planting designs that are really beautiful. So once again, they capture people's imagination, and then once you've got their attention, you can then teach people about all of the edible plants so that we can be creating these really diverse plantings that really inspire people. So this is a edible forest garden I created, and instead of planting the ground cover layer, I actually seeded a woodland meadow mix, because what I wanted to do is I wanted to cover quite a big area, but I didn't have a very big budget. And quite often what this means when people create new gardens is they will put down a dead mulch of wood chip or compost, or yeah, there's a whole host of other different mulch materials now. But then they'll plant plants and they'll be at a distance, which will mean that over maybe 2-3 years, there will be gaps between the plants. That then means that when you have these gaps, there is an opportunity for weeds to get established. So my thinking is could I create a edible forest garden and then sow a woodland meadow mix as the ground cover, so that you've got these multi-layered different edible plants, but then from the first year, you've got all of these different flowers providing beauty and biodiversity. And so in this edible forest garden, I sowed the woodland mix, then there's shrubs, small trees, edible perennials, climbers. And once again, it's this idea of, you look at the garden and you think, wow, that's beautiful. And then you can go into more detail and look closer and realize that there's many different edible plants. So this is in the second year after establishing it, and this is sweet rocket or Dame's rocket, which is a really great perennial vegetable where you can use the flower tops, or I eat the leaves regularly in salads as well. It's the edible forest garden again with all of these different woodland wildflowers, and then the layers of edible perennials. And you might be thinking, what are these stacks? So these stacks of stones, this is what I dug out of the soil as I was going through to prepare the ground for seeding the wildflower mix and planting. And so I came up with using them creatively to create a sort of ecological art that provides habitat or ecological services for wildlife. So putting these into this landscape, this creates all of these different crevices so that wildlife, that provides wildlife habitat. And then you also, the good thing about this is there's varying micro conditions for insects. So the north side will be cooler, whereas the south side will heat up. So, and then if you look closer into this planting, there's all of these different edible perennials, plants for tea, medicinal plants. So this is really one of my favorites, and this is ostrich fern, which I know in North America there is a bit of a delicacy, and you eat the new fronds. You could use them much like you would asparagus, and then you can see on the right them sort of like blending into all of the different wildflowers. Yacon so on the left, you can see Yacon growing with Ami majus sort of blending in. And actually Yacon is in the daisy family, and it has these absolutely beautiful orange flowers late in the season. It's actually in Cornwall, it's flowering now. But then Yacon produces these incredible large bulbs or tubers in the soil, which one of its other common names is ground apple. And it's a bit of a mix between a sort of a starchy potato and an apple. You can eat it raw, or one of my favorite things to do with it is to cook it in a roast dinner. And actually my partner, she made this absolutely beautiful spiced Yacon jam. And I really like this plant because it can cope with competition. And when you're creating ecological plantings, close-knit plant communities, you really want plants that can cope with that competition with other plants. Once again, if we look closely, you can see fennel, which is used for tea, and the seeds are really good spice. Chives, more of the Dame's Rocket. This is a real beautiful plant that I'm experimenting with, and it's Rudbeckia. And this specific species is used in Appalachian mountains as a perennial vegetable, and it has a long history of use. And down on the right, you can see this is a picture I've taken out of James Hitchmo's book, Sowing Beauty. And here is the Rudbeckia growing in a woodland with Monarda didyma, which is also a perennial vegetable. So, and this is a really good plant here in the UK to be using in edible forest garden, because it has very late flowers, which a lot of UK species will end their flowering earlier on in the year. So really being able to use plants from North America, you extend the season. But this is the only Rudbeckia I know of that has been used for food. So here we have another edible forest garden I've created, and this is a different method. This is using sheet mulching, and rather than using a seeded layer, just using the typical multi-layered planting. And this was this is created on a large estate, and one of the key things is very low maintenance requirement for the planting, because there isn't the manpower to do it. So over the last few years, this has only taken a few hours of maintenance a year. It had no supplementary watering, and over the last 2 years, we've had droughts every year in the spring. And so this is designed, one of the key things, what I want to emphasize here is the ground cover layer, and how important that is to close the canopy and reduce the ongoing maintenance of the planting. So you can see earlier on in the season, and then you can see there's a Carex layer, and then these different herbaceous perennials emerge out of that layer. So in this planting, the establishment method I used was I cultivated the ground, which a lot of people wouldn't cultivate the ground, but and it depends whether I cultivate the ground or not. But a lot of the time when you're doing this work professionally, I've found the best results from cultivating the ground for that initial establishment. Really, I don't remove any of the weeds or the grass, just dig that in, and then I'll cover it up with cardboard, and then get a sort of low-grade green waste compost to put on top, just as really a sterile mulch, and then I'll plant into that. And this has been key really to reducing maintenance, because having that thick cardboard layer, that suppresses any seed growth or the other the existing plants or roots from underneath. But then having that sterile mulch, that also stops any other weed seeds coming in. So that's why with this method, I've managed to create a large planting with very low maintenance inputs. So this is a part of the planting plan. You can see the whole planting down on the left-hand corner, and then a smaller section, which was the planting we were just looking at. And what I want to just emphasize here is the ground cover layer, because that's done in a matrix, a mix of different species that are planted in using plug plants. And so using plug plants so that I can use a lot of them at quite a close spacing, so that they close the canopy quite early on. And one of the keys when you're using plug plants is either you need to have a very open start, so without any competition with other plants, if you're going to use the small plug plants. But if you're going to use the landscape plugs, you can plant that into with other plants. And landscape plugs are just an incredible thing. You can see them on the right. You can see they've got a much bigger root system. And the good thing about using landscape plugs is you can save money. It's much cheaper. It reduces the embodied carbon because you can buy a whole tray and you don't have the same amount of resources used, and it's much lighter for transportation. And then if you have a landscape plug and you clean the roots off, is actually a real quick establishment. Is the edible forest garden planting again. You've got the thick ground cover, which is really providing that role of closing the canopy and reducing any weed encroachment. Then we have the red veined sorrel, Aquilegia, Norwegian Angelica emerging out of that. And really I found Carex being one of the best plants in my experiments. Here you can see there's a Carex mix with daylily. It's quite hard to see the daylily, and some other wildflowers I've allowed to grow in it. And within that mix of the Carex and the ground covers, there's the shrub and tree layer, which you can see just a small twig tree there, which I believe is Aronia growing out of the ground cover. Another one of the edible forest garden with the red veined sorrel, musk mallow, Dame's rocket, Norwegian Angelica, and a kiwi berry. Another one of the mix. They're one of the plants in there. Sweet woodruff. This is one on the left, the little ground cover plant, and sweet Sicily. So you might be thinking, okay, this is a nice idea, edible forest gardening, but how much food can you actually get from this? And this is an example of an edible forest garden created by Graham Bell in Scotland. And he's actually recorded how much food he's harvested from it. And in 1 year, he managed to harvest 1 ton of food out of 900 square meters. And whilst producing that food, he's also recorded 35 different species of nesting birds in his edible forest garden. And he's been growing this for, I think it's over 20 years now. There's a little picture of the before and the after. So then with the perennial vegetables, really there's so much opportunity. And this is Stephen Barstow's garden, and he lives near the Arctic Circle in Norway. And in his garden, he's grown over 6,000 different edible plants, and he's actually got the world record salad of 537 species in one salad. So there's so much opportunity to use these different edible and ornamental perennials to be able to create really imaginative ecological plantings across our landscapes, our urban landscapes and our gardens. So recently, Nigel Dunnett shared an image of this brownfield site with this aster, which it's a novel ecosystem because it's a non-native plant getting established in a brownfield site that's been disturbed by people. But these brownfield sites now have been really highly valued for their ecological value. But what I want to propose is, could we not create imaginative food businesses where we actually provide grants for people to come up with ideas to tend these brownfield sites or urban landscapes, to be able to create these imaginative businesses, like using, say, this brownfield site as an example, and then planting the aster scaba, which is used in Korean food, in kimchi and other dishes. So actually, could we not provide grants and support to be able to create these really imaginative food businesses to support people to be tending edible ecosystems across our landscapes, novel ecosystems that support people with our nourishment, but also support a thriving ecology. So really, what I want to do is just invite people to experiment, because there's so many possibilities to experiment with the landscapes we're creating, to create truly multifunctional landscapes that help us to adapt to the current challenges we're facing. Thank you, everyone. If you're interested,
sorry, go on,
quickly,
Sid.
if you're interested as well, yeah, I am available for planting designs, talks, workshops, and really I'm interested in collaborating with other professionals, opening up the discussion. And you can find my work on social media or my website, and yeah, I'm open for discussion. Thank you.
Fabulous, Sid, thank you. Do you want to come out of screen share? And
yeah,
and gosh, there's been lots of chat going on, lots of chat, lots of questions, lots of things which we can work through, at least some of them. I've got a couple of questions to kick us off. Jeff Lawton, back in the Jordanian desert, was he irrigating that, or do you know much about the background of what how he achieved that?
Yeah, I believe he was. You would irrigate to initially get things started, but
Right.
then once you have irrigated, once you start regreening and regenerating a desert, that then creates the pressure potential between land and sea to start encouraging water into the landscape. Whereas as soon as a landscape has no vegetation, then it doesn't. There's no rain because it can't be recycled.
Right.
So yeah, initially he would have needed to irrigate.
There were a couple of questions about your use of carex. Now, is carex edible, or are you simply using that as a ground cover?
That's just as a ground cover.
Just as a ground cover. Okay,
yeah,
that's great. That's
just
great.
as a functional ground cover.
Yeah.
Could I just pitch it? I mean, I think the problem I always have with the whole edible forest idea or edible landscape is that it involves an awful lot of species that if you are an absolutely dedicated grower, you will use. But for the vast majority of people, a lot of these plants they're quite kind of marginal in terms of the role they could play in our diet or the amount of preparation they need, or simply, they're not part of our food culture. And I just wonder how practical the idea is outside of actually a relatively small circle of people who are completely dedicated to it. I mean, how much is it a concept that is either transferable or can be scaled up?
I think yeah, that's really key, and that's really open for debate and research, because if you find that anyone his career is experimenting with unusual edible plants, and I think really there's such an opportunity to experiment with these methods to and then value add on crops, so kimchi businesses or other imaginative methods. So yeah, currently to be able to grow an edible forest garden, you need to be a bit of a specialist. But look at the uptake now, what I've seen over the last, say, even over the last 5 years, of people being really interested in perennial vegetables. And some of these are incredible. Like, yeah, we may not use them that much in the UK, but that's because we haven't known about them. But if you go to like Korea with this aster scaba, that's a really good crop for them. So I think that there's so much opportunity to experiment with these plants. I mean, we have tens of thousands of different edible plants available to us today. So really, we need to be starting to experiment with them because of the current challenges we're facing through climate change, food security, and all these other issues. So I think we really need to be experimenting in all different directions.
Sid, there's been a few questions about, or lots of questions. I mean, and Arit's asking, where is your restaurant? Question mark, question mark. Have you been asked to write a book? Because lots of people are saying, well, like, where do I start? I wouldn't know what's edible and what's not. So have you had any offers of writing a book on all of this?
That's something I do want to do, yes. I would love to write a book. I did think about starting one this winter, actually, but I'm also really focused on creating workshops and talks. And so in the spring, I created my first online course, which was really just an initial course to how to create a wildflower meadow. But I'm currently working on how to create an edible wildflower meadow. And yeah, so I'm really at a point now in my career, after the last 14 years of experimenting with these things, I'm at a point now where I really want to share and collaborate with other people. So yes, the answer is yes, I'd love to write a book.
Right. Well, I think you should definitely get in contact with some publishers, because I think, you know, it would be a fantastic idea. Arit's also asking where you got your landscape plugs from.
I grow them myself.
They've not really hit the British market. North Creek in the United States are using them and really promoting them. Yeah, I've actually just before this, I was actually out planting my own homegrown landscape plugs, or as we call them here in Portugal, alveolus florestais.
Easy for you to say, Noel.
Which is, I mean, they're normally used for producing tree seedlings, but I've been growing lavender and phlomis and sort of Mediterranean shrubs, and they are really brilliant. And I mean, I just hope that somebody in the British nursery industry will invest in this, because it's a good, and as you say, an incredibly sustainable solution for high density naturalistic planting.
Well, and of course, Olivier Philippe has designed his own landscape plugs.
Yes, they're sort of bigger,
yeah, and had them made and designed for his own use. Okay, and gosh, there's I think, Sid, I will definitely copy the comments box and send it to you, because there's quite a few bits and pieces. But Fiona's saying, Sid, you should speak to Time Bank Hull team behind Feast. Happy to put you in touch. So maybe, Fiona, you could just type a bit more information about what that is. Time Bank Hull and Feast. It'd be interesting to know a little bit more about that. The edible aster you have said a few times. There were a couple of questions about your use of cardboard. Was this I think a couple of people have asked pretty much the same question. You turned over the soil, you put cardboard on top, and then you put your mulch, your compost on top of that. Is this very much in the Charles Dowding school of preparing beds? Is that the same method?
Yeah, it's the same method, and you don't need to dig the soil. But as I run a landscaping business, I'm doing this professionally, I need successful results, and I've personally found better results from doing an initial cultivation and then putting down cardboard and the mulch on top. But if you don't dig, there's more weeding, there's other like perennial weeds, what I found get better established. So that's where I do dig, and there's actually a lot of people actually message me saying, oh my god, the old untold damage you've done by digging. But it's an initial dig, and if you look at like around, so when I was in Sardinia, you'd see wild boars digging underneath like 1,000-year-old olive trees. So people might say, oh, you're going to disturb the roots, you're going to do untold damage, but it's a natural process, digging. But it's really just creating the conditions necessary and the beneficial conditions to be able to then support your new plants.
Right, right. We've got Emma from Sweden saying, as an ethnobotanist, do you see the edible meadows as part of the historical gardens in the future? I'm very interested in the debate around natives versus non-natives in meadows, and in Sweden, at least the natives are very much winning the fight.
Well, that's a big topic.
It is a big topic. It's a very popular topic in America.
On the subject of non-native plants, if I may just throw in a kind of psychological hand grenade, you haven't mentioned what I think is one of the most fantastic, inverted commas, wild vegetables, Japanese knotweed, which is
a hand grenade.
Yes, I mean, I don't know if you've ever tried, but you know, the tips, flash fried, bit of soy sauce, really wonderful. And you will find online there's actually a whole website dedicated to Japanese knotweed recipes. It's very tender. It doesn't have the bitterness that a lot of wild vegetables have. So is there room for Japanese knotweed in the?
I think you can potentially be sued for that comment, Noel. Actually, there's some questions about.
I think.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say about the native, non-native debate, and it's particularly with like edible meadows, is you wouldn't ask a farmer if he's only using natives, would you? You wouldn't ask a market gardener if he was only using natives, because it's just unrealistic. But there's thousands of edible plants available to us today, found in wildflower plant communities, and if we look to our gardens or our urban landscapes, where these are already novel ecosystems, non-native plants are here and they're here to stay. Even the most veteran ecologist, native enthusiast is likely going to be growing non-native plants in their garden. And we've been moving plants around the planet throughout our history, and so do birds. So it's a natural process. Plants have come up with really ingenious ways to encourage us to help them reproduce. So, and then coming in there and saying, I'm only going to use natives in my garden or urban landscape, that doesn't make sense to me. But yeah, if you've got some really beautiful native plant community in a woodland, bog, or or like wild habitat, I wouldn't say go and introduce a load of non-native species.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about a garden or urban landscape, that's a different situation.
Yeah. There's been a couple of mentions of course, of Martin Crawford. Sally Morgan's just mentioned that you can buy many of these plants at the Agroforestry Trust in Devon, Martin Crawford, and also Mandy Barber's Incredible Vegetables, also in Devon. I think the West Country's definitely got the.
And of course, Mark Diacono, he does.
Yes. Yes, I'm not sure how much Mark is selling at the moment. I mean, Mark certainly was a great advocate of Yacon, and you know, used to talk a lot about Yacon. I'm just scanning through to see if there's any other, because there's been such a lot of debate in the box here. It's quite fascinating, but I think there's been people answering other people's questions, which has been really wonderful. Very nice sort of community. Angela's asking, and I don't know if you can remember back your image of the lupins. There was an umbellifer between the lupins. Have you any idea what that was, Sid, or not?
No, I've got it. If I can find it out, I've got Sepp Holzer's mixes,
right?
But I can't remember exactly what umbellifer it was.
Okay, don't worry.
Simply on a health and safety note, I think one of the interesting things about eating plants is that there are certain families, you know, like Malvaceae, that seem to be completely innocuous, or indeed, I won't mention in case Annie goes off the deep end, but the Polygonaceae, again, they seem to be completely benign. Other families, like umbelliferae, have some truly horrific poisons. You know, just think of Socrates, as well as edibles. And I think, you know, umbelliferae are one of those where if you don't know what it is, don't touch it.
Interesting. Yeah, there was actually a very interesting program on Radio 4 today about eating fungi, and so I think because it's that time of year. Well, yes. I think Sid, we could go on for hours on this, but there's been lots of really lovely comments, and you've lots of thought-provoking. one final question I'd like to say is, are you being asked to go into schools and talk to children about all of this?
No, I haven't. It's an interesting area, but no, I haven't.
Well, I mean, you know, maybe you should be just sending at least all the schools in Devon and Cornwall some information about yourself, because it's getting kids. I mean, you know, this is where you started, isn't it, as a child out in Portugal, getting excited about growing, and you know, it's passing that on, isn't it? So yeah, definitely a book is for sure. Get that book deal.
And especially with a lot of the edible perennials, is they lend themselves really well to school environments, because quite often in schools people grow a vegetable garden, and then over the summer when it's time to harvest, all the kids aren't at school, whereas a lot of the perennial vegetables, they can be harvested in the winter or in the autumn or early spring. So actually a lot of them are much easier to maintain. They're ever living, whereas a lot of annual veg, they're like babies. You have to tend them, and they're much more difficult to actually succeed with. So yeah, I do think using edible perennials in more interesting plantings would be perfect for school plantings.
Yeah. And how are you finding your approach to designing edible meadows from the client's point of view? Are you having to really sell this idea, or is it being received with really sort of, you know, open minds and so on?
I think with my client bases, I run quite a small business, and so I don't take on a lot of work, and I really choose clients who are already really on board with the sort of style I do. But my clients have been really on board with it. But every time I create an edible meadow, how to use it, how to use all the different plants, one thing I will say is this is quite a specialist subject. If you look at a planting with 30 different edible plants in it, you really want to be learning one plant at a time. It's like foraging, but there's so much potential to be able to contribute, even if you use a small percentage from that. These are nutritionally packed foods. So even if it's just supplementing your diet, these are the nutrients you need for a healthy diet. But I think just a last touch on that is, I think that the edible meadow concept is perfect for chefs and experimental cooks, because like I said earlier, chefs are really interested now in unusual tastes. So to be able to have an edible meadow, a low maintenance biodiverse meadow they can go and harvest all of these different interesting crops from, I think there's a real opportunity there.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Sid. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I've loved some of the terms that you've used have been lovely, like intelligent tending. I think that's lovely. And infochemicals, you know, just some really lovely expressions that I think we've all learned a lot, and I think you've sort of piqued our interest on lots of this. But lots of luck, and we're looking forward to that book coming out, and I'm glad that
maybe a members' day down there with, you know, the interesting lunch menu.
Yes, we'll come down and spend a day with you, Sid. How about that in St. Ives? Who's up for that, everybody? Yeah, Wendy's put her hand up. Get that flight booked. Okay, well, listen, thank you everybody for tuning in. We've had a lovely number of people, and I'm not surprised, Sid, because you're a bit of a superstar, and lots of luck, and let's keep in touch, and we'll send you all your comments, because there's some lovely comments. Okay,
that'd be great. Lovely.
Thank you, Sid. All the best.
Everyone.
Thank you. Take care. Bye bye.